Good evening. We have a somewhat different program this holiday evening. As America celebrates more than 2 centuries of independence, we look at a nation barely 2 years old. It is Zimbabwe, the former British colony of Rhodesia in Central Africa, racked by years of war between white diehards and African guerrillas. Now its president, Robert Mugabe, struggles to satisfy the revolutionary appetites of 7 million blacks while trying to reassure a dwindling population of whites. How he's succeeding is the subject of this report, edited from a recent BBC documentary. The narrator is Ali Mazuri, a Kenyan-born political scientist who now teaches at the University of Michigan.
This is Great Zimbabwe, once the flourishing capital of a great Shona kingdom. These are the corridors of power, the passages of privilege of an ancient African civilization. For 600 years, these walls have stood here, although they were built without mortar. The walls themselves are an impressive testimony that Africans are capable of a uniqueness which the white man has not always recognized. But the great kingdom of Zimbabwe did not last. Perhaps it was a failure of social institutions. The effectiveness of the government and the economic skills available failed to keep pace with the needs of what had, after all, become a rather complex society. Alongside this political decay, there might have been ecological imbalances. The soil no longer able to support an expanding population. A fuel crisis as trees for firewood were excessively depleted. Land overgrazed. Desolation setting in. At any rate, Great Zimbabwe foundered and withered away. 5 centuries later, Robert Mugabe is trying to build up a new Zimbabwe. But what kind of pattern is he following? Is he trying to follow the pattern of my own Kenya, a model of racial reconciliation and private enterprise? Or is Mugabe seeking to create another Mozambique, a model of revolution and a state-controlled economy? Or is he, in fact, seeking to rediscover the uniqueness which is embodied in this remarkable monument to ancient Zimbabwe? People voted for him because they were hungry for change. But can their sense of national renewal be sustained for long? Enthusiasm is a perishable commodity. Perhaps that's why Mugabe vilifies his adversaries as a popular way to mobilize support. Mugabe is also trying a policy of reconciliation, an olive branch to those same adversaries. It's a strategy very much in the Kenyan mold. Mobilization is more like Mozambique. Both policies are expected to flourish under the umbrella of Mugabe's one-party state. Whether all Zimbabweans are yet ready to be part of Mugabe's people is another matter. Many whites still live in a Rhodesia of their own. Judging by the Kenyan parallel, that will last a long time. Martin Luther King used to argue that desegregation was not integration, that ending the color bar was not enough to bring the races together in America. It's equally true in Zimbabwe. But it's more than a lack of harmony. 2,000 whites are leaving every month, and that's a bigger exodus than Kenya's in the same period. I've spent about 3 weeks here, and I think during those 3 weeks, I've probably heard more racist remarks than I hear in a year or two in the United States, or than I have heard in Kenya since the 1950s. Can you explain the phenomenon?
It's become so ingrained now. It's something to talk about, something to ridicule, to be unkind, but, you know, it's just a pastime, and it's something very difficult to shed from oneself. But I think those people that are left here now don't really mean it. It's merely a talking point.
You've got to give us time to get to know each other. You know, on a certain level, we do know each other. Some of us have friends in all sorts of groups. But generally speaking, people have got to have time to get to know each other. There's still a lot of, not fear, but ignorance about the different races.
I've heard at least one major political figure in this country argue that this is the most magnanimous post-war arrangement that's taken place anywhere. The man himself was black, and he said, here were people who are hanging us a few months ago. You know, here were people who are hunting us down, and now there they are interacting with us in parliamentary exchanges. Where else has this sort of thing happened so soon after the war? What's your response? Do you think the blacks have been magnanimous towards the whites?
Yes.
Well,
I do.
there's no doubt that we have been surprised at the leadership displayed by Robert Mugabe. He said reconciliation. I think he's a pragmatic and very clever man, a very competent man. And he sized up the situation very well. He said that the way to get this thing off the ground is to put forward a very strong message of reconciliation and harmony.
Right.
And he succeeded brilliantly.
Hello, people.
Joshua Nkomo is less ready with praise. In February, he was sacked from the cabinet. You can't have two top men in a new country, even though the fragile alliance between the two parties has survived. After 30 years at the head of the nationalist struggle, Nkomo is now on the sidelines, the latest stage in a historic tribal, regional, and personal rivalry. Mugabe moved against him after hordes of arms were found on property belonging to Nkomo's party. Enough to start a war, said Mugabe.
If Mugabe had treated those arms as we have treated other arms we have discovered, and then together tried to discover who was responsible without making a noise about it and handling it as government, at the time when I was still minister, we could have handled this as government, and I could have handled as leader of ZAPU to discover what happened. But I was never given a chance. I was accused and everything. It was a political hullabaloo. There was so much insult on me and all over in the papers and radios and television. Now, that was very unfortunate, very disruptive, very brinksmanship.
This is a failure.
This part of it really I did not expect, and it's a sad chapter in the history of our independence. Very sad one.
The repercussions of the Nkomo affair are still being felt. The workers on Zimbabwe's largest vegetable farm have now been caught up in the conflict. They are all on notice from the government. The farm was owned by ZAPU, Nkomo's party. When arms were discovered on other properties, the Niger company was also declared unlawful and a liquidator appointed. Soldiers kept guard. The government's case is that Niger was helping finance a future Nkomo takeover and that the farm was in a strategic position close to Salisbury. So, if there are rotten tomatoes here tomorrow, and 400 out of work, it will be because of a political struggle that's still not resolved after 2 decades. Do you feel the political noose getting tighter around your neck, if I may so put it? Do you feel vulnerable?
My neck is very big.
As Churchill said, some neck.
It's very big, my dear, for that type of thing.
But do you think you could be detained?
Not that I've been detained before, it doesn't mean a thing.
In the struggle to rebuild or redesign Zimbabwe, land is pretty central. It was, after all, what the war was all about. Thousands of young African men and women left their villages, their homesteads, to join the ranks of the fighters. They were fighting for land, as well as for liberty, for farming, as well as for freedom. When you look at it, they were, in fact, giving up their lives, and over 20,000 of them perished in the war. And yet, when a visitor comes to Zimbabwe, he is struck by how much land there is. 7.5 million people sharing 40 million hectares of land. Statistically, that comes down to over 10 acres for every man, woman, and child in the country. But there is a real problem of distribution. 5,000 white farmers own as much land as 6 million Africans. Partly because the first settlers took the best land in Rhodesia, and partly because of their superior skills, the white farmers became the backbone of the country's economy, alongside its mineral wealth. Jim Sinclair is president of the Commercial Farmers Union. His case is that European farms produce 3 or 4 times the output on African communal land, and that the economy simply can't do without them. He also argues that since commercial farmers are the biggest employers in the land, any large-scale move to dispossess them could leave thousands unemployed. Sinclair's farm adjoins an African communal area, the chance to show visitors the contrast between farming styles.
The left-hand side of the fence that you're looking at produces 88% of the food marketed in this country. The right-hand side of the fence produces 12. That is the difference, and that's the important factor. We believe that not only from the employment point of view, from the effective use of land, from the efficient use of land, from the benefits derived from the land, that the chap working for a commercial farmer is better off than a guy under a resettlement scheme.
A related point is whether you are making enough allowances for what appears to be a genuine hunger for land in this country, and also for what appears to be a widespread feeling that the war was about land and that Africans should really enter into the business of owning and cultivating land, not as employees, but as independent or communal cultivators.
This must be one of the few countries in the world where man automatically, per se, feels that he should have a piece of land. There are very few people in town, urban workers, very few of my own workers, who do not have a stake in a piece of land somewhere in this part of the country. Now, that is a situation that I believe this country has to move away from. Why should a man have a job and a piece of land? The reason is historical, that in the past he hasn't been paid enough to set aside anything for when he's old or make provision for his old age. And so the land has tended to do that. Now that's an imbalance that has to be corrected, and we have to have social security schemes and pensions and things like that which will take the place of that little bit of land being viewed as a pension. If everybody in the country wanted a piece of land of his own, we would have to take over half of Zambia as well.
But it still matters how many of those who do own land are Africans. But in 2 years, only 2% of white land has passed to black ownership. Kenya transferred 7 times as much in the same period. On what was once a tobacco farm close to the Mozambique border, 24 families are starting a new community. Nothing of value remains. Windows, doors, roofs have all been stripped. The white farmer poured oil down the borehole before he left. The pump engine's gone too. Only 12,000 families have been resettled so far, partly financed by Britain. But they'll need money on the Kenyan scale if the plans for the next 3 years can have any hope. And even those with new gardens to cultivate are far from content, as a government delegation discovered. The guest is Mrs. Turairopa Nongo, Minister for Community Development and Women's Affairs.
Isisi mbili weza lukuno. Isisi atizie shirungu. Kana kunyora kwa chukubata uti pensula. Pamu kunyora kwa chukubata nisa kumsoro. Zino, zwaka diko wakura noti sapata rukuku. Azenza ana asina nai. Andi ndizo. Zwaka diko uti imimo zwezi mawaya kuno nazi. Mufano uti wanao nga wafundira wapa miti. Mangwana chayo chayo. Zwaka diko hizo zazigoneke wa ere.
Hallelujah.
But this group has gone a stage further. They moved onto a neglected farm near Salisbury, but then agreed to pay £400 rent a month and have started a cooperative. I heard no Marxist rhetoric, yet their idealism is closer to the collective concerns of Mozambique than to the capitalist tendencies of Kenya.
Balik. Come on.
Come out, buddy.
Come out.
But over all this youthful exuberance, there now hangs a shadow. The army has moved in. The eyes of former comrades in arms are upon them. Zimbabwe farmers know all about producing a high yield. The depot of the Grain Marketing Board near Sinoia is witness to that. There's maize here for Africa. But even when output is achieved, there are other problems. Last year, as an incentive to farmers, both black and white, the government offered an exceptional price. The farmers responded. They produced a record-breaking harvest. It was really impressive. This is the harvest. It is a monument to productivity, a mountain of maize that is truly evidence of output. The problem is how to shift it. 1 million tons of maize is waiting to be transported, but the railways can't cope. There aren't enough wagons. Foreign earnings sit in the sidings. The problem begins in the railway workshops at Bulawayo. Half Zimbabwe's locomotives are off the rails. The white fitters who used to service them, monopolizing skilled jobs to the exclusion of blacks, are leaving. 30 are downing tools every month. Zimbabwe is hoist on the petard of old Rhodesia. Last year, South Africa lent 25 locomotives, but then withdrew them just when they were needed. And that's not the only problem. Zimbabwe is landlocked. The long routes to the sea are prone to other Southern African hazards. In October, the Pungwe River Bridge on the line to Beira in Mozambique was blown up. It was 2 months before the trains ran again. Then the marker buoys leading to Beira were destroyed, putting the port out of action. Zimbabwe's shortest route for exports was blocked. It was said to be the work of the MRM, the Mozambique resistance movement, in rebellion against the Mozambique government, but also hostile to Zimbabwe. There is another rail line from Salisbury to the Mozambique coast. It runs south to the main port, Maputo. But for months it has suffered regular derailments and at least one landmine explosion. So rail traffic is thrown back on the old routes through South Africa, which carry 70% of Zimbabwe's freight. And the Afrikaners have used their stranglehold. Once last year, they reduced Zimbabwe to 2 days' reserves of oil. And many believe South Africa is not just tinkering with the timetables.
Yes, of course, she's manipulating the situation. She would want us to recognize that we are dependent on her. And therefore to desist from what is our Africanist duty of rendering within the orbit of the OAU support to the liberation struggle in South Africa and in Namibia. And so there has been this strategy, a strategy she has for Zimbabwe to destabilize our political system, because she believes very correctly that if we succeed politically and economically, then our success will inspire the people of South Africa to fight more, to fight harder, so they can achieve the same system as we have achieved in this country.
Zimbabwe's dependence on South Africa goes further. 1 in 5 jobs in the clothing factories rests on exports to South Africa. They are guaranteed by a preferential trade agreement that Mugabe has just renewed. It's just another fact of Southern African life.
There's nothing contradictory about that. We have inherited a situation where Zimbabwe was politically, diplomatically, economically linked with South Africa. We severed all political and diplomatic relations with South Africa. But we could not do the same with economic links. It takes time to reduce your economic links with any one country. As you cultivate new partners, new markets, you must accept a period of transition during which you're trading with your old partner.
So the message from Zimbabwe at the end of 2 years becomes clear. For all the rhetoric, Robert Mugabe is more cautious than some critics may admit, or his more radical colleagues would like. He's vulnerable to South Africa, and that restricts his options. He sees socialist Mozambique floundering, having lost its white skills. So reconciliation remains a major aim. He's appointed 2 more white ministers and brought more Nkomo men into the cabinet. And the one-party state still beckons. But what are Zimbabwe's eventual aims? Are they socialist or capitalist? So far, the country seems closer to Kenya than to Mozambique. But what does the Prime Minister think?
My response is very clear. Is this another Kenya or is it another Mozambique? It is clearly another Zimbabwe. That's the response. We have adopted socialist principles as our guiding ideological principles. And in implementing our policies, this is what is going to guide us substantially. But we do recognize that in implementing our socialist policies, we've got to reckon with the realities that we have inherited. There is a capitalist infrastructure in the country, there is private enterprise therefore, and that since we are not in a position to overhaul this infrastructure, even if we wanted to do so, and we don't want to overhaul it, at least at this stage, we have to accept a kind of partnership for now between private enterprise and socialism, or the public sector and the collective sector that we're going to cultivate in the country. And during that period, which is really a transitional period, I don't know how long it will be. It could be a decade, it could be 20 years, when the transformation is taking place. There has to be a recognition that those enterprises which are private and are operative in the national system have got to be made viable during that time. But they too have got to work towards national goals and do so very vigorously, being prodded by the state, being encouraged by the state, and being given the necessary assistance by the state. That's how we see it as Zimbabwe and not as Kenya or Mozambique.
Pasina Kombo, Namsorewa, Nastole, Ian Smith, Icho, Icho.
Since that documentary was completed, Mugabe's security problems have grown. In late June, gunmen attacked his residence and fought with guards. The government blamed Nkomo followers and has started a crackdown on dissident former guerrillas. But another problem has improved. The exodus of skilled whites has slowed down. The number emigrating in the second quarter of 1982 was the smallest since independence. A Western diplomat said those who were staying seemed to have confidence in Mugabe as the great conciliator. Well, that's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
Robert Mugabe, the leader of Zimbabwe, caught in a war of words and blood with an old ally. Good evening. In the African nation of Zimbabwe in the last 24 hours, the country's 7 Catholic bishops issued an Easter pastoral letter accusing the army of running a reign of terror caused by wanton killings, woundings, beatings, burnings, and rapings. The government stoutly rejected the charge, claiming the bishop's statement was irresponsible, contrived, and propagandistic. Also, in London, Joshua Nkomo, one of the 2 central figures in Zimbabwe's troubles, said the new atrocities report had caused him to delay his return to Zimbabwe. He fled 3 weeks ago, claiming an order had been issued to kill him. The man who gave the order, said Nkomo, was Zimbabwe Prime Minister Robert Mugabe. Nkomo and Mugabe, together they fought for and won independence from white minority rule in what was then called Rhodesia. Mugabe leading his guerrilla fighters from the Shona tribe, Nkomo his tribesmen from the province of Matabeleland. After independence 3 years ago, Mugabe and his ZANU party defeated Nkomo's ZAPU party in a national election. Mugabe became prime minister, Nkomo joined the cabinet. But they have since come to a violent parting of the ways, each now accusing the other of using murder, kidnappings, and terror. Nkomo to overthrow the Mugabe government, Mugabe to put down the Nkomo dissidents. Tonight, in a documentary report, we look at Zimbabwe's troubles 3 years after independence. The reporter is Gavin Hewitt of the Canadian Broadcasting Company.
In Zimbabwe, the peace that was born with independence lies broken. But the rural African, eking out a minimal existence, is still looking for the benefits that he hoped independence would bring. An abandoned white farm, the relic of a guerrilla war that was fought over the question of land. A guerrilla commander once said, "Our people are naturally farmers. They love the land, and yet they've been deprived of Zimbabwe's rich soil." So they fought to regain what they believed the white man had taken from them. Because of this, the government of Robert Mugabe faces an acute dilemma. He has to satisfy his Africans' expectations. Yet at the same time, he needs the skills and expertise of his white farmers in order to feed his country.
These men are fortunate. They have been given land which was not being used by a white farmer. They are fortunate in that only 15,000 families have been resettled since independence. That has been done without displacing a single white farmer. If this is a revolution, it is painfully slow. Across Zimbabwe, tens of thousands of Africans are squatting illegally, awaiting resettlement. Mugabe the revolutionary has in reality been a model pragmatist. The slow pace of the land revolution has encouraged the African to seek his own solutions. Here, near the border with Mozambique, hundreds of squatters have set up home illegally, tearing down trees, often growing their mealy corn with lasting damage to the topsoil. It is almost impossible for the white farmers to have them removed. The white man is learning that his authority has gone. Mike Boswell Brown produces kiwi fruits. When he confronts his squatters, he and the African knows that his words carry no force.
Whose mummies are those up there? Could you come here a minute, please? Are these your mummies? The cattle up there?
I know the owner of this village.
Not the owner of this village, you mean my village?
I have no idea.
You know you people are going to be moving soon, don't you?
When?
Well, very soon. Very, very soon.
Why?
Well, because you shouldn't be here. Look what you've done to the bush, and look on the way up from the Essex Road. Look at all the lovely trees that's all been cut down. Don't you feel it's sad? Really? I mean, do you think Mr. Mugabe, do you think Comrade Mugabe would like this? Would he like to see all this land and bush destroyed? Because he doesn't like the squatters, you know. He doesn't like them.
It's squatters because we are all proper where we've been born before.
Well, this is typical. Many of them feel that because their great-great-grandfather was born here, they feel entitled to come back and come and squat here. But they've got no rights whatsoever on this land, and in time they will be moved.
But the estates and ranches are still great money earners. They have largely been untouched by government reforms. Since independence, only 45,000 whites have left the country. 165,000 remain. The farmers' wealth is in their land. If they were to sell up, the government would prevent the export of their fortunes. They, much like their cattle, are hostages in their own country. Here in Matabeleland, they are also caught in the middle of a new war, this time between black and black. If land was the Africans' main concern, it is being overshadowed by conflict. For tribalism, the scourge of Africa is surfacing in Zimbabwe. On the outskirts of Bulawayo, in the heart of Matabeleland, a troubled people consort with their witch doctor. They gather in fear that Zimbabwe may be on the brink of a tribal war in which they, the Matabeles, would be bitterly opposed by the more numerous Shonas. The message they hear and believe is ominous.
There's a main war here, a big war that is like to come.
Zimbabwe's main concern today is tribalism. The largest tribe, which is Shona-speaking, migrated from the north. By the 18th century, they'd consolidated an empire that included most of the present-day Zimbabwe. Later, a tribe that spoke Ndebele settled the southern and western parts of the country, having fallen out with their Zulu brothers in the south. Today, these Matabeles make up only 20% of the population. The reputation of Prime Minister Robert Mugabe is threatened by tribal conflict. His magnanimity on coming to power 3 years ago had raised great expectations. Now it is being asked whether the era of reconciliation is over. Mugabe, the Marxist ex-guerrilla leader, had been forgiving to the white community. Partnership had been offered to his African rivals. Today, he talks openly of crushing his enemies. At his rallies, there is already emerging a youth brigade, a uniformed arm of Mugabe's political party. Slogans exhort the 5th Brigade to defeat the supporters of opposition leader Joshua Nkomo. Many believe that Robert Mugabe is slowly but steadily creating the one-party state he has long believed in.
We believe a multi-party democracy is a luxury. That, in fact, if you are to unite the people of a country who are one nation, regardless of their ethnic groupings, of their race, of religious and political affiliations, you must ensure that there is a national government and not governments. And that national government must derive from one political umbrella within which there is an inbuilt system of democracy. And so a one-party state is our choice.
Joshua Nkomo, grand old man of African nationalism. To these people, he is king of Matabele land. It is said that he never accepted the defeat of his ZAPU party at the polls by Robert Mugabe. It is the rivalry between these two men that threatens Zimbabwe with tribal conflict.
ZAPU is uncrushable, you know. A lot of people try to crush ZAPU. They find themselves crushed. This is exactly what is happening. Now, all this behavior doesn't crush ZAPU, it crushes them.
He's no leader. He is one of the false prophets, a coward, a confusionist, a man dedicated to retardation of the progress of the African people. And what he has done here in Matabele land, I shudder to think of.
They are now South Africa is recruiting Ndebele-speaking people from Zimbabwe, either in South Africa or from this country, or those who have deserted from the army that are being taken across South Africa and are being trained to be sent back here. They've attempted to do that once they've sent in a group from South Africa to come in and destabilize this country, committing acts of robbery and so on, carrying the badge of Joshua Nkomo on their laps. But after contact with our forces, we captured some, only to discover that despite the fact that they were carrying Joshua Nkomo's laps, they were not internally trained dissidents. They had come from South Africa.
So the government believes that Nkomo's supporters were planning to seize power. As evidence, they cite these caches of arms which were found last year on Nkomo's farms. Prime Minister Mugabe says Nkomo is being helped by the South Africans. This sabotage equipment was found on 3 South African soldiers killed inside Zimbabwe last year.
They had a mission to commit acts of sabotage, and so there is that evidence, apart from individuals or pairs of people who have been infiltrated to do reconnaissance. We have had these 2 very disturbing incidents whereby the groups were sent on definite mission to commit acts of sabotage.
Landlocked Zimbabwe is especially vulnerable to economic sabotage. The vital rail link to the ports of Mozambique is regularly attacked by anti-Marxist rebels supplied by South Africa. Now, with Nkomo and the Matabilis increasingly hostile to the Mugabe government, South Africa has the opportunity to encourage and support subversion. Already, some of the disaffected are making the journey south to join an estimated 600 rebels that are being formed by the South Africans into a Matabele brigade. The fundamental question that exists in Zimbabwe today is whether Joshua Nkomo, the loser at the polls, has been plotting with his supporters and his former guerrillas to seize power. Or has the government been seeking a pretext to rid itself of a turbulent opponent and is now embarked on a ruthless and brutal campaign against Nkomo and his ZAPU party? The discrediting of this aging man has almost become official government policy.
He's a wily creature, an old politician, we grant him that, but not always very honest, I must say. And so one cannot just read his intention from his statements.
Councillors of ZAPU are also being used to stock arms and so on. Now, we don't believe that the machinery of ZAPU could be used to that extent without ZAPU leadership itself knowing. And in fact, we have cases that are coming to court which show that Nkomo has been involved not only at a long distance, but practically giving advice to persons who have now been captured.
In Matabele land, some of Nkomo's former guerrillas who deserted the National Army are paraded as dissidents, bandits who rob and kill. The integration of two guerrilla armies was the great post-independence challenge. Here, the rocket launchers are displayed as evidence that the dissidents are organized by ZAPU. Between 3,000 and 5,000 of Nkomo's men are said to have deserted. Whilst they are rounded up, the leaders of ZIPRA, Nkomo's former guerrilla army, are on trial. Lookout Masuku was commander of ZIPRA for the latter part of the war. From 1980, he became a lieutenant general in the Zimbabwean army. But last year, he was arrested for plotting the overthrow of the government. Dumise Debengwa was ZIPRA's chief of military intelligence. He is said to have struggled to keep the separate identity of ZIPRA alive and cement its links with ZAPU politicians. Debengwa is reputed to have an enormous following among the former ZIPRA guerrillas, perhaps rivaling that of Nkomo himself. The arrests of Debengwa and Masuku prompted the desertion from the army of hundreds of former ZIPRA guerrillas. The Herald newspaper has acted as a government mouthpiece against ZAPU. The people are said to be denouncing ZAPU in their thousands. Most damaging are the often repeated allegations that Nkomo is seeking support from the South Africans. The rhetoric has grown more strident. Mugabe insists the bandits must be crushed. And then one of his ministers states the message clearly: ZAPU must be liquidated. Siringane Mpofu is a ZAPU district official who once bought arms for ZIPRA. On February the 8th, his 4 sons were shot dead by government soldiers. His story was translated for us by Makatini Gaduza of ZAPU's Central Committee.
They were asking for distance. Where are the distance? That's the question they asked.
Where are the dissidents?
Then one started to shoot 4 of the young children who were eating there, killing them all. 4.
How old were these children?
The other one were 12 years, the elder one.
Do you think it was because he is a member of ZAPU?
ucabanga ukuthi kwenziwa kubani lilunga lezapho?
Nxa ngicabanga mina umcabango wami ngibona kuyilokho ngoba into abasebenza yayimbi kakhulu babengasalandela umthetho kahulumeni basibonga ukubulala abantu.
He says partly yes, because what they were doing, they were just killing everybody in the area.
Anxious faces await the outcome of yet another visit to the police station by Joshua Nkomo. Everyone knew, and the government confirmed to us, that they were preparing for him a treason trial.
Listen.
A week after this, he had fled the country to Botswana and from there to London. Dr. Nkomo did disown the dissidents operating in his name, but he accused the government of using its 5th Brigade to murder his party officials rather than defeat the dissidents.
It's not the National Army. Let's make it plain here. It is the 5th Brigade. And the 5th Brigade says itself, it is not a government organ. It is a party organ. But this killing thing, I couldn't possibly keep quiet. Couldn't possibly. So I stand by that.
The 5th Brigade, like the new militias, is drawn solely from Mugabe's own Shona-speaking tribe. It is asked why the Prime Minister is building a 20,000-man militia loyal primarily to his party while the army is overmanned. Like the 5th Brigade, they are being trained by the North Koreans.
Since 83 in South Korea, from 1st of February to the middle of April, by mobilizing a large number of 188,000 odd strong, including...
Prime Minister Mugabe has given these North Koreans the task of training the units that will combat internal subversion. A government spokesman had earlier told us that the Koreans had left the country. For the first time, we have evidence of their continuing influence.
I would like to pay tribute to our comrades in arms, the instructors from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, who, with the assistance of instructors from our own Zimbabwe National Army, have brought the men under their command to such a high standard. Once again, we have an example of the splendid generosity and cooperation of our brother, the great leader, Comrade Kim Il-sung.
In front of his North Korean instructors, Mugabe identifies the enemy as Joshua Nkomo and the South Africans.
It is surely to the undying shame of Joshua Nkomo and his ZAPU that he and his party now seek the active support of South Africa in order to cause chaos in the country and so attempt to bring down the people's government.
We have spoken to a number of church leaders in Matabeleland. They are all too frightened to speak out publicly. Indeed, one senior churchman said, "I'm sorry, but I don't have the moral courage." But the accounts they've received from their mission stations and their clinics coincide, namely that the soldiers of the 5th Brigade have engaged in widespread cruelty and systematic terror against the Matabeles. Quite simply, said one priest, they are out of control. We have evidence that the government is aware of these reports, but has chosen to ignore them.
A group of refugees compiles another list of the dead. No one has an accurate record of the number who've been killed. The churches estimate it is over 1,000. One report from the Catholic Bishop of Matabeleland was given to the Deputy Prime Minister on the 14th of February. It was subsequently shown to Robert Mugabe. The Anglican bishop has called for an independent inquiry. That too has been ignored. Such are the horrendous tales that these people tell that already one Western nation has suspended its aid.
How many people died how many people were killed?
There were 6, and one mother who was pregnant, they asked him that, where is your husband? And then says, my husband is working at Well. They say, you are telling lies, you are a wife of a distance, and then they cut him, and then was dead.
They cut the woman?
Yeah, they say, this is a child of distance, you are killing a distance inside your stomach. And then he was dead with a child, with a pregnant.
And you actually saw
all
this
of
happen?
them, there were 7. Yes.
You saw this happen to this woman?
Yes.
What about the accusations that have been made that in your drive against dissidents, in fact, it's children, women, people who are related to ZAPU officials who've been killed or who've been raped or who've been assaulted?
Those are Nkomo lies. Nkomo is all out to discredit anything that stands for law and order
and yet
for
church
peace.
officials in Matabeleland have made such a report.
They have been told these lies by Nkomo and their dissidents. If there is any church official who has met that accusation, my view is that he's a supporter of Nkomo, a member of ZAPU, and therefore is a dissident. He is putting out dissident propaganda.
With Joshua and Nkomo in exile, the government is carrying a message to the Matabeles. If they choose to fight, the 5th Brigade is already in place. The government's hope is that with Nkomo out of the country, his influence will subside and the party split. Prime Minister Robert Mugabe has been the voice of moderation, promising Dr. Nkomo that should he return, he would be protected. But his ministers preach a different message, namely the liquidation of a political movement.
ZAPU should now be liquidated because it has no role to play in our country. The only role that ZAPU can play is one of promoting rape, killing, burning of government equipment, retardation of economic progress. Nkomo is a coward, a wolf that walks during the night. During the day it pretends to be peaceful, sleeping under the shed. But let the night come, it runs about ravaging all that is there. Thus Joshua Nkomo, the Honorable Comrade Joshua Nkomo.
Two months ago, Joshua Nkomo was attending the wedding of his daughter. This is his home movie, which he showed us before his flight into exile. His son-in-law, John Nlovu, and his daughter are now under arrest for having helped Nkomo escape. The wedding was that of the daughter of a patriarch, with 20,000 in attendance. Many of the ZAPU officials present have either been killed or arrested. The question remains, can Zimbabwe live in peace if the Matabeles have been alienated? There are still in the National Army 12,000 of Nkomo's former guerrillas. If they were to desert, Zimbabwe would face a new civil war. That then is Mugabe's gamble, that his opponents can be banished painlessly.
A couple of updates. First of all, that Western nation on aid was Sweden, and it has continued its aid. Also, Nkomo's daughter has since been released from jail. The other members of his family remain in custody, and as of tonight, Nkomo remains in London. We'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Jim Lara. Thank you and good night.